Hello everyone, hopefully this video is going to come out and everything's working fine. I've had to change over devices because it works out that what I've been recording on hasn't been working properly, and you probably saw from the last video I've done that is on the YouTube channel that the volume and mics weren't working. Well, there was an internal issue with the device, so I had to send it away. Hopefully it'll be repaired. I'm on an old device now, fingers crossed this all works. Right, this is really a continuation on with regards to the spining of arrow shafts. You can see my setup. I've got a bit of the spining jigs here so you can see what I've been using. It's more to explain to yourselves what's happening with an arrow, or what's happening with the wood and the spine, etc, etc. Have a piece of offcut of the timber that I've rejected, just to help explain a few more other bits and pieces. Now, a lot of people out there will say, oh, you can work out what the piece of wood will give you as spines or arrow spines by calculation. To some point that is true, but actually it doesn't really work, because the calculations they're talking about, based on any piece of timber, and this is normally how I get my lumps of timber in long lengths, is based on tests that were done by Victorians and even some modern ones that are done now over the last 20 years. But it's based on an average across a certain size of lump of timber. Now, when you start cutting up the timber, you're going to start changing the parameters and how it's going to work. Yes, if you're cutting it into chunks, you can still do your calculations. But when we start doing it into arrow shafts, you're talking cutting the timber into such small sections that the calculations don't work. And the reason why I'm going to say this, and probably everyone's going to poo-poo me and rip into me or whatever, fine, it's open to criticism. Everyone has their own opinion. But basically, you're then going down to what the fibres are doing within the timber. When you start talking about anything more down to when you're starting to talk about arrow shafts that are, the 1/2 inch to 3/8, 23/64, 11/32s, 5/16s, 9/32s and quarters, it comes down to what's going on with the fibres, and it's called the growth fibres. When a plant or tree or anything, when it grows, it creates fibres to help interlock each other and to keep its strength during growth, to help against everything, basically. And majority of the time it's down to helping survive nature, the best way I can describe it, the winds, etc. Now, when you're talking about a growth cycle, particularly with the Scots pine or the Scandinavian redwood, it's in a cooler climate than the UK and most of the other areas of the world. So you're talking, this is coming from sort of mid Sweden, mid Norway, probably slightly further up towards the Arctic Circle, close but not too far, because the growth slows down even further, and you're going to end up getting more resin within the wood. The more resin you've got, the more sticky and oily it'll end up being. It makes it really awkward for arrow shafts and to process it. But basically, because of where it's coming from, and I'll try to do a few more close-up videos of this if I can. Hopefully you'll be able to see the end. You've got a reasonably tightness of grain here. The grain can be slightly more apart and slightly tighter, just depending on the growth cycles. So most of the trees that these are coming from is probably talking 30 plus years old, anywhere between 30 to 40 years, where my timber is coming out of, and it's harvested, and it is a harvestable product. So that's why it's over that length of time to get the sizes of tree, shall we put it, you want. and that's what dictates the growth rings. And most of that is down to, again, the seasons are growing. So as most people will know, when you've got a colder and longer winter and you have a shorter summer, the growth rings are going to be closer together. And then again, so by doing that, only the growth time is during those summer sunny periods. So you're going to have the fibres that grow are going to be shorter and more interlocking. And that's a majority of the reasons why the Scandinavian redwood and Scandinavian redwood, Scots pine, as also known as, is a heavier arrow shaft in weight and mass and density. Why have I said all those three? Because each terminology of those means a slightly different thing. Some people disagree, but it does, under an engineering side of it, under a mathematical side of it. So it's why a lot of people are slowly moving over to using the Scots pine or using the Scandinavian redwood shafts, just because of the durability that it's got inside it. Because of the tighter fibres of growth, the tighter growth rings, etc., etc. If you go down to a lot of the spruces, particularly the German spruce, and where it tends to be with German spruce, tends to be from, say, northern Germany, and it actually goes all the way down to mid to probably the bottom of Germany into Romania, etc. They're still called German spruce. They don't tend to they have a harsh winter, but not as a longer period as the Scandinavians do. So you'll end up with growth rings further apart. And what will also happen is the fibres within those, between the growth rings and interlocking between the growth rings, are longer. Now some will say, well, if you've got longer fibres, it's going to be a stronger wood. No, it doesn't really work like that. If you go down to, I'm going to use some engineering terminology that's probably going to baffle some of you, Young's modulus, etc. When you're working out how much flexibility something's got, the more interlocking those fibres are and the shorter those fibres are, particularly in wood, the greater strength you get. It's one of the reasons why, for my home that I'm in, for example, was built in the 1950s. Now, the roof rafters that are up there for the original part of the building, I know just by looking at them and looking at the timber, are Scandinavian redwood. Now, the extension that was done by previous owners 12, 13 years ago, those timbers are still structural grade timbers, but you'll find that they will be coming from some sort of spruce or Norwegian type pine, but majority the spruce. Why you sort of do start questioning, why do they do that? Effectively, quicker growth spurt, so you can plant more trees and harvest them quicker, and cost. So if you go now into any of your local hardware stores or DIY places or asking for structural timber, majority of the time they will give you a spruce graded in Cs 1 to 3, and it's a spruce. And you'll find, if you ever compared a structural timber of the old days to now, you will find that the structural timbers that they have to specify are actually bigger than what they would have been back in the 1950s, going back to the Victorian periods, just simply because they were using these two different species of wood, and the Scots pine or the Scandinavian redwood is just that little bit stronger because of how the growth within it works. So hopefully that explains a little bit of what's going on there. Now, there's a lot of people who are saying, but I don't want to use Scandinavian redwood or Scots pine because I've always used POC or spruce. That's fine. It's your personal preference. It's how you like it, what you've always shot, what you've started with when you first came out. And a lot of people are moving over to the spruce because they are a lighter shaft. They are completely lighter compared to the Scots pine. You're talking about 15% lighter, maybe plus or minus a couple of percent. So by doing that, it means because they're lighter, you will potentially get more distance. But they tend to be, that's the best way to put this, they tend to get a lot more hidden shakes within them because of how it's a quick growing. Not always the case. I completely admit that. It's not always the case. But they tend to be less durable as well. So when you're using or shooting your arrows, and we've all done it, and I do it on a regular basis, particularly if you're doing it in field archery, you got what you call a tail whip, or the arrow, back end of the arrow, you've got the spine slightly wrong, and you're trying to go through a narrow gap, and the back end of the arrow clips a tree. Arrow explodes. That's it. You're stuffed. Yes, that can happen with the Scandinavian redwood, but it tends to be on arrow shafts that are slightly older, over 5 to 7 years old. But again, depending on how hard you hit it, no matter what arrow shaft you use, it'll explode. Now, I've found, and there's a few others that have found, the Scandinavian redwood is a lot more durable, particularly from taking hits, just because of how the growth of the fibres are within the arrow shaft. You'll find a lot more now of bowyers who are making bows and specifying that there's a minimum weight that they want to shoot off of an arrow out of their bow. There's a lot of people say, poo-poo. They're the bowyer. Try to follow their advice as much as you can. Now, I'm in the old school of what Chris Boyton used to do and a few others. Don't worry about the weight of the arrow. It is up to a point. Now, if you're shooting distances in field archery, in ILF-NFS or EFA, you're not really going to be shooting more than maximum 50 yards. If you're for that sort of distances, the comparison, say you're shooting at 40 yards in comparison to shooting a spruce shaft to a Scandinavian shaft, in your bow hand, when you raise your bow up slightly more, because a Scandinavian redwood is that little bit heavier, you're talking probably only 1/4 of an inch or 3/8 of an inch that you're actually raising your bow hand by. And people go, no, it's not. There's a lot of people who out there who want to get point on at 30 yards. Fine, that's perfect. And it's basing everything on the arrow weight. What they need to try to do is get the spine right of their arrows. And at the same time, then the weight of the arrow shaft can follow. Now, if you're trying to say with regards to the weight of the arrow shaft, if you're going to someone who's supplying you the arrows, please don't go to them and say, I want this weight of spine of arrow, but I want it in that spine as well. So you're saying, I want that spine as closely as matched as possible, or exactly the same, and I want that weight. It doesn't happen. Because from batch to batch of arrows you're making, depending on the growth cycle of that tree, of that timber, you will find the weight will vary from each batch of arrows that you buy from someone. And you're talking potentially sometimes, and I'm talking in grams, not grains, up to 5 grams different. So the best way you can say to someone, if you're buying some arrows from them or the arrow shaft, say, I want a certain spine. If you've managed to find a set of arrows, an arrow spine that suits the way and suits your style of shooting and goes with your bow, I want that certain spine. And then can you, if possible, get a close match weight within that spine? Because that is what they're going to give you. for each time they give you a set of arrows. It won't be the same weight the next time you get them. Sometimes you can sometimes do that. You can sometimes get the same weight as the last time, but it doesn't always work. So if you're going to go out and ask a fletcher, as everyone should know, that's who makes your arrows up into 4 arrows. You want to say to them, I want this spine, but can you closely match the weight of them within that spine? That's all you need to say. Don't go around trying to say, I want that weight and I want that spine. It doesn't work. Again, people are probably going to come back with opinions on that. Fine. It's just from the years of experience. I've been shooting now for over 30 years. I've got the information and other bits and pieces that Chris Boyton had done, bits and pieces, and from years of talking with Chris. He probably had something in the region of 5 to 7 years of development to find the right wood to use to produce arrows that he wanted to make it worth, with a bit of development in the background when he was still working and talking with Dick Galloway. So you're probably talking, probably around 40 years, probably 45 years with Chris, with all the different stuff that he played with, even down to all the museum stuff that he was messing around with as well. And then you've got all the experience that he gleaned from Dick Galloway, who he learnt from. You just got to remember, Dick Galloway was probably within the last 5 or 10 people ever to have a true apprenticeship, which there was an apprenticeship scheme for bow making back then. And it also included arrows. And it was it's based on a lot of information that came from Victorian times and from those bits and pieces, but if people go back and learn what was going on, the Victorians were pretty much on the money for most of it. And if you go back to most of your mathematical stuff for structural engineering, which that's the background that I have, most of it's Victorian people. Anyway, that's by the by. So, going back to the arrow shaft. Now, I'm going to I'll show you both ends if I can, if it comes out in the camera again. So, I'm slicing them up. I'm slicing the boards up that way. Some people slice them that way, so you have 2 splits, come top and bottom half. Now, everyone's saying, well, surely you'll get the same spine of arrow going through here. No. Because of what's going on with the wood, you can see how the grain growth is within it, can't you? Yeah? So if you've done a structural calculation within what the bending moment, etc., of this timber would be, it's actually taking an average of what it would until it point of breaking. Now, if I cutting slats and creating the shafts from this, here I could probably, if I'm doing a 5/16, probably here, I don't know. This is just extreme guess, and this is just how can I put it? This is just assumptions. Maybe these are 30/35s. Well, here, because you're getting close to the heartwood, it could be that you're getting 50/55s. Now, people go, oh, well, it should be the same. No, it won't. So when you're asking, saying, right, I need you to provide me this, even down to my people who are the stockiest size supply, they say, I want all of these arrows in this spine. I've got no chance majority of the time to know what I'm going to get, because across this whole piece of timber, which is 150 mil wide by 25 mil thick, I could potentially get something like anywhere between 15, maybe call it 15 to 16 shafts out of it, maybe a bit more, we'll see. Within that lot, I can get an extreme variation. On a 5/16 spined arrow, I can get anything from a 20/25 to a 50/55, even sometimes a 55/60 out of one piece of timber. So that's people, and I said, people say, oh, you can do it by calculation. Chris never found it, and he'd done it for 40 years. Okay, I've been only doing what I've been doing probably now properly for three and a bit years, and I still haven't found it. I'm potentially producing anything from 3,500 to 5,000 shafts at a time, majority of the wood I'm buying. And I'm buying it in from the importers. And the last lot of timber that I bought was over 800 kilos. And that produced somewhere in the region of 5,500 shafts. But I'm losing anything up to 40% of that, because when you start going down to, you've got to take the shavings out, the sawdust, blah, 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 blah. And I'm going to lose some shafts because they're either too weak, they've got splits in them, or they're just no good at all whatsoever. There's just so many defects in it, it's just not worth it. And that's why you just can't fathom what you're going to get. Now, so that hopefully that gives you some background. Now, with regards to the spines, I'm going to go and grab some arrow shafts just beside me, which are the 3/8. I've got a handful here. I might do a close-up of those so you can see what's going on. Right, these were the shafts we were looking at of the 3/8. That's just what I had to hand, which were the 105s to 110s. Look at the ends. And everyone would say, surely they can't be that spine, because they've such variation in grain. Again, it's the fibres within the timber that dictate what's going on with the grain. I'm going to flick it over. See? Such a grain variation. That's why you need to have a rig, a setup, so you can measure the spine of the arrows, how much they bend. Hopefully that making sense. Right, so basically what you've got here is measured on this one, because the bigger one at the back I've got, the needle's just too close. It's easier to do it on the proper jig that I've got. So it's based on the AMO valuation, which is the industry standard for measuring arrow shafts. Now, the grain on these is so variating, it's ridiculous. But they are coming out to be 105 to 110 pounds shafts. Again, based on the fibres of what's going on inside the timber. As I said, you'll see the close-up, and yeah, you would think, nah, that can't be it. Don't go on what's going on with the grain of the wood. That will never tell you what's happening. It's the fibres within it, unless you're going under microscopes, etc., and then sitting there with cross-section. Who's going to keep breaking arrows and cross-section to then find out what's going on? You won't. So again, this, as I said, this video is trying to follow on from regarding what's going on with the spines of the arrows from the video I've done before. There was the video that Robin Robin Anthelay did with regards to the 1/2 inch that I shared, also known as Robin of Nottingham. Now, he is taking 1/2 inch shafts off of myself and then unspined, and then creating a spine by tapering different ways of doing it. That's absolutely fine, and it works really well for how he's doing it. Now, with regards to that, that's great working on a 1/2 inch and a 3/8 shaft. If you try doing that very similar on an 1132 down to 516 and 932 1/4, there's not enough, how can I put it, cross-sectional area, basically what the end of the arrow, like if you chopped it into bits, to be able to do that, because you're then going to start changing the overall dynamics of how things really work on the arrow shaft. If you are trying to taper your arrows and you're looking at the 3/8 below, you want to be trying to buy your arrow shafts in predefined spines already. So in the, call it the 90/95s or 95/100s, or even 5/16, 40/45s, etc. And only then taper a maximum of 10 inches. Aim for 9. Because by doing that, between most of us who have been researching it and what's going on, you're only losing between 2 to 3 pounds of spine deflection if you do it over that route. So you have more control of what you're doing with the arrow shaft. So you're not, how can I put it? You're not changing, you're not going to end up tweaking it too much. And if you start changing too much particularly on the smaller diameter shafts, you're going to start tweaking again how the arrow bends during flight, which is the aerodynamics, flight of dynamics, which then risks those arrows breaking even down to when you're releasing the arrow shot straight out. So just think about it, of how and what you're trying to do with the arrows and how you want to do it. Majority of the people are tapering the back end of the arrows down to feel better between their fingers, particularly if they're shooting split fingers, Mediterranean loose. But majority is to get point of center further forward. Point of center further forward is, how can I put it? It's partially a good idea because it would potentially, in over a long distance, particularly if you're doing on ArcheryGB, etc., you're trying to get to those 50 meters and the 70 meters. It just gives you that, it just gives the arrow in flight something just that little bit more. And this is only from the Fletchers and arrow makers, etc., the information that they're coming back to me on, who I speak to on a regular basis. But that's not always the case. It just depends on your bow and how you're shooting. You may find that rear end tapering doesn't work for you and you've got to go with a parallel. Again, it's play, tuning, working out what you're trying to do with your arrows for you, like I explained in the other video with regards to the arrow spine. So take your time, see how it all works. But it's all personal preference. It literally comes down to personal preference. Okay, folks? But always be patient. If you're trying to buy arrows from anyone, make sure you know what you're trying to buy, particularly with the arrow shafts, etc. Try to go with their advice, but majority of the time, as I said in previous videos, if you can, go to somewhere where you can try out a variety of different arrows in a variety of different spines with a different pile weights to see what suits you and the bow you're shooting at that time. It could be, as many people find, different bows they're shooting will shoot a different type of arrow. And I said, sometimes it may be a Scandinavian redwood / Scots pine doesn't suit your bow, so you've got to shoot a spruce arrow, or you've got to shoot a Port Arthur cedar, or you've got to shoot a Cypress spruce. Who knows? But you've got to try it all. That's the only way to do it. Now, also at the same time, going back to arrow spines and arrow weights, etc., etc., and how the bowyers are starting to specify minimum weights of arrows to come out of their bows, particularly on the long bows, and it's now happening on what I call thumb draw bows. Some people call them horse bows. A lot of people are worried, a lot of the bowyers are worried that you're going to try to shoot a too lighter arrow from your bow, which I can understand that. If there is not enough density to your arrow, because all you're worried about is getting the weight of that arrow perfect and forgetting the spine. Well, you could have a perfectly weighted arrow, but it could be that out of 12 you've got caught on, particularly on 1130, well, alder shafts, let's pick 1132 for example, you could have a spine weight of going from a 40-45 up to a 50-55 because you've gone and said, I only want to match the weight of the arrow shaft. Now, the spine's all wrong, potentially, across the whole lot. So you're not getting the energy transfer from your bow into the arrow properly. So that is why the spine of the arrow is key. So get the spine of the arrow right. I can't reiterate that enough to people, how much it bends. And then try to get the weight worked out in that. And what people will find is if they get the spine right of what they're shooting for their bow, the weight of the arrow shaft is actually above what their bowyers are asking for, majority of the time. And what people forget is you've got to add the bloody pile weight on and the feather weight. And if you're shooting with plastic nocks, you've got to add that on as well. So it's the overall weight of the arrow, not just the bare shaft. Bare shaft is a good idea to start from because by the time you've added the pile weight and everything else on, it will be over what you need. But again, because these people have just got their obsession with this weight idea, what they end up also doing is shooting a too small of the diameter of arrow out of their bow. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I've known people over the 30 years that I've been shooting trying to shoot a 932 out of a longbow or recurve that is anywhere between 60 to 75 pound in weight, draw weight. It's never going to work because there is not enough density, diameter, or mass and density of the arrow to absorb the power or the energy from the bow into the arrow. And it just wants to fold up on itself, and the arrow is just basically going nowhere. You've just lost all the energy that you're trying to generate from the bow to transfer into the arrow. So the arrow just ends up tumbling or goes wibble wobble down the thing. But what you're also doing is, because not all the energy is going into the arrow, it's going back into the bow. And particularly on all wood bows, that's where you're going to start finding issues. You're going to put the shock or the energy back into the bow, so that will then end up finding any weaknesses within the woods of the laminations or a one piece. But if it's more down to the laminations, it could end up being it's the glues as well during the laminations, and it could end up delaminating. So again, all I'm going to say to people is get the spine correct, and you'll find that a lot of your defects that if you've had bow breakages, etc., will start disappearing because you've decided to get the spine of arrow correct for your bow. Hopefully that all makes sense. But as I said, going back to the lump of timber, I cannot guarantee what I will get out of that piece of timber. Never in a million years. So that's why there's a waiting, or sometimes a waiting list for certain arrow spines and arrow shafts, because I don't know what I'm going to get until I put them through and spine them all. And again, I can end up throwing away quite a few because it's just rubbish, absolute rubbish. Now, the other element on the arrow shaft, people are now starting to say, I want a perfect grain, the full length of the arrow. Great, but you're talking about a piece of wood. Now, that's never going to end up happening. Ideally, from knock end to halfway on a 32-inch arrow, you want a lovely straight grain. as much straight grain as possible. There could be a few bits of deviations down there. Anything beyond halfway as a straightness is a bonus. So if you're getting towards 20 inches, brilliant. And if the grain starts going off in another direction or it's got more of a wobble, that's what you want more down towards your pile end when you're making your arrows up. But ideally, you want the straightest grain possible across the whole length of the arrow. It doesn't always, you can never get that guaranteed. Ideally, half, which is 16 inches, best at 20 inches. Anywhere in between, superb. So you're trying, so you start, you're going to start rejecting lots and lots of stuff. Now, people say to me, oh, would you be doing what? I'm trying to get you the best arrow shaft out, what I'm selling to my stockists and what I sell through the website. Majority of the stuff that I sell through my website is overstock where the stockists don't want them because they've got lots of already. So if you see what's on my website and you then go to me, oh, can I have, I haven't got it. You might have to go and talk to one of my stockists, which there's a list on the website at dalesarchery.co.uk, and they'll have, majority of the time they'll have it. But as I said, grain of arrow, look at it, all your arrows that you're working with. There's a video also that Philip Head has done on his YouTube page about spine of arrow, etc., and talking about the deviations through the grain. Sometimes you can have it so it's almost tiger striped and it will still sort of work, and the arrow will still work, but you have more risk of breakage, particularly in doing field archery. Ideally, particularly if you're shooting on longbow, you want straight grain up to half the length of the arrow shaft. If not, ideal and the best is 20 inches, and then the other end is all to do with the pile end. When you're shooting Archery GB and occasionally on EFAA or etc. or IFA, you've got open clear shots. So you're not going to really go around hitting trees, etc., as you do in the NFS, the other field archery disciplines around the world. So that's why I'm saying the other to go, try to get down to your 16 inches, because you're trying to get through the smaller gaps. It hits anything, you've got more strength, particularly on a long bow where the arrow is trying to go round the bow, or round the bow, shall I say. It's the halfway, it's between halfway to the knock end is the bit that really that's the doing most of the bending. So that's where you want the straightness of the grain as much as you can. Hopefully that helps, makes it sense. Great. Now, if there's anything else people want me to try to talk through and explain, hopefully this video has tried to do that. Just put some comments on and I'll try to pick it up in another video. This one's been a bit long, I apologise for that, but hopefully I've got most of the information across that you need, and it just helps massively of what you're doing. I am in the background trying to come up with a method that I'm happy with and a finish that I'm happy with for doing tapering on arrow shafts from all the arrow shafts that I supply. So 1/2 inch, including 932s. Hasn't been ideal, hasn't been great on some of it. I'm up to something like jig 8, 9 or 10, something like that, to try to get something that works really well and gives the finish that I'm after. So please be patient, and hopefully you've seen that I've got the GoFundMe on that. Everything costs money because I'm having to buy bits of material, bits of everything, and it's my time to develop this. So if you can help me go down that route and fund that, brilliant, people. You're helping me and yourself and others to get to that position. Anyway, have a good time, enjoy the rest of your day, and fingers crossed this all makes sense to you.